I'm buying your freedom, not your life. I'm setting you free. Charles Hartwell's calloused hand pushed every coin he owned, his life savings, across the auctioneer's desk. Annabel Leafley, 52, stood trembling, barefoot, not from shame, but shock, unable to believe what she was hearing. No man had looked at her with anything but pity in 15 years. No man had defended her honor in 2 decades. Until now.
Hello, compliments of the season. If you love heartwarming stories about life in times past, then you'd enjoy these stories. Comment where you're watching from, like and share these videos with loved ones as you enjoy them. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel too. My team and I have something free and beautiful for you once we hit the 1,000 subscriber mark. It will be shared in the community. You know, we go to great lengths to make these videos, and your support means a lot to us. Therefore, we plan to give back to you once we are able to, so be a part of what we are building.
I'm not buying you. I'm setting you free. Charles Hartwell's voice cut through the crowd like a blade. His calloused hand slammed every coin he owned onto the courthouse steps, silver and copper scattering across stone worn smooth by judgment. Annabel Leafley stood frozen on the auction block, her 52-year-old frame trembling not from fear, but from disbelief. No man had defended her in 2 decades. The whispers had started before sunrise in Fort Smith, Arkansas, July 1879. They said Annabel Leafley was too old to be worth keeping, too weathered to deserve kindness, too used up to ever belong anywhere again. Her brother-in-law, Walter, had brought her here after his new wife demanded it. 1 less mouth to feed during the drought, 1 less burden. 2 sacks of grain, that's what he got for putting her up here. The sun beat down merciless and white. Annabel's bare feet burned against scorched stone, but she refused to flinch. She clutched the only possession they'd let her keep, a faded photograph of her daughter, dead from scarlet fever 10 years past. She had survived 52 years of being invisible. She would survive this, too. The auctioneer called her name with disgust. Annabel Leafley, 52 years old, can still work, strong enough for laundry and field labor. Laughter rippled through the crowd like poison. Who'd waste food on something that worn out? A man jeered. Then Charles stepped forward, his storm-gray eyes locked on Annabel as if she were the only person breathing. He was young, maybe 35, with trail-worn clothes and dust-covered boots, but his voice carried the weight of a man who had lost everything and refused to lose again. And in that moment, Annabel wondered if mercy still existed in this brutal world. If this story moves you, if you believe some truths need to be told, don't let it disappear. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Charles turned to Walter, his jaw tight with controlled fury. What did you get for putting her up here? Silence swallowed the square. Even cruelty had its limits of shame. Annabel's voice cut through, clear and steady. 2 sacks of grain, so his family wouldn't starve this summer. The Hartwell farm stretched across sun-scorched valleys 15 miles south of Van Buren. Annabel stood in the doorway of the small guest room, her chest tight with emotion. A real bed, a door with a lock on the inside, privacy, dignity. She had not known dignity in years. That first morning, Charles made coffee and set out cornbread and butter. Figured we'd need something filling, he said. Long day ahead. No commands, no cruelty, just respect. They walked the property together, 40 acres of dried cotton fields and collapsed irrigation channels. The creek still ran strong along the eastern border, but the water never reached the crops. Charles pointed to the broken wooden channels snaking through the fields. Built these 5 years ago with my wife, he said quietly. Haven't had the heart to fix them since she passed. Annabel studied the land with keen eyes. If we redirect the creek flow here, she said, tracing a path with her finger, and rebuild these channels, the water would reach every acre. It's not too late to save this season's crop. Charles stared at her. You know irrigation engineering? I know survival, Annabel replied. My late husband and I ran a small farm in Missouri before he died. I kept it going 7 years alone before the bank took it. They worked until sunset, hauling timber and tools. When Charles struggled with a 50-pound beam, Annabel lifted the other end without hesitation. Her arms shook, but she held firm. "You're going to hurt yourself," Charles warned. She shook her head. "I've carried heavier. Burdens come in many forms." His expression shifted, anger flickering not at her, but at the life that had demanded strength through suffering. "Then your family worked you into the ground." "Yes," Annabel said simply, "but at least now I know what I'm capable of." That evening, over a simple supper of beans and bread, Charles said something that made her breath catch. "If anything here doesn't work for you, we'll change it. You tell me, and we'll make it right." No one had ever cared whether she fit into a space, but Charles did. For the first time in years, Annabel felt something dangerous blooming in her chest. Hope. Weeks passed like water smoothing stone. Annabel felt herself softening, purpose returning to her life in quiet, unexpected moments. The farm came alive under their shared labor. Irrigation channels stood strong. Cotton plants pushed through parched earth, reaching for sunlight. Hope replaced despair. The people of Van Buren whispered behind closed doors. "That old woman and young Hartwell living alone together? It's shameful." But Charles paid them no mind, and neither did Annabel. They had work to do. One afternoon in late August, as they inspected the cotton rows, dust rose on the horizon. 5 riders approached fast. Annabel straightened, her hands tightening on the hoe she'd been using. Charles stepped forward, his expression hardening. The lead rider dismounted, a tall man with cold eyes and a cruel smile. "Name's Jasper Caldwell. This here's my brother Monroe. Mr. Patterson sent us with a message." Charles's jaw tightened. "What message?" Jasper gestured casually around the property. "You owe Patterson money from that loan 3 years back. He's calling it due. Sell the farm or he'll take it another way. Fires start easy in Arkansas summers. Cotton burns real quick, and accidents happen to folks who don't cooperate." It was not a suggestion. It was a promise of violence. Before Charles could respond, Annabel stepped forward, her voice steady. "There's a problem with your plan. Extortion and arson threats are federal crimes in Arkansas. Marshal Greer in Fort Smith would be very interested in 5 witnesses to criminal conspiracy." Jasper's eyes narrowed. "You think an old woman can stop 5 armed men?" "I think you were sent to scare us, not kill us," Annabel replied calmly. "Murder leaves evidence. Patterson's too smart to leave evidence. You'll go back and tell him we're not selling." Jasper stared at her for a long moment, reading her certainty. Then he spat on the ground. "This isn't over, woman." The riders thundered away. Charles let out a shaken breath. "That was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever seen." "They didn't hurt us," Annabel said, though her hands trembled. "That's what matters." If you believe courage can bloom at any age, subscribe so you never miss a story that proves you still matter. They rode into Fort Smith the next morning and filed a formal complaint with Federal Marshal Duncan Greer. Now any move Patterson or the Caldwells made would be public record. The marshal took their statement seriously, his weathered face grave as he wrote down every detail. The work continued. August heat pressed down like an iron, but the cotton was thriving. Annabel and Charles fell into a rhythm that felt natural, almost sacred. Dawn brought coffee shared in comfortable silence. Days brought hard labor side by side. Evenings brought conversation that grew deeper with each passing sunset. One night in early September, they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance across the fields. The air was finally cooling, autumn whispering promises of harvest. "I thought I'd never feel alive again after Sarah died," Charles said quietly. "Losing her and the baby in one night, it broke something in me. I stopped believing good things were possible." Annabel's throat tightened. I stopped believing anyone could see me as more than a burden. My daughter's death made me invisible. Then my brother-in-law made me worthless. Charles turned to her, his eyes reflecting lamplight. You're the strongest person I know, Annabel. This farm would have died without you. Hell, I would have died without you. You brought life back to this place. You gave me back my dignity, she whispered. That's worth more than any wage you could ever pay. The space between them felt charged, electric. Charles leaned closer, his hand finding hers. Annabel, Thunder cracked overhead. The first fat drops of rain splattered against the porch. Within seconds, the sky opened up in a furious downpour. They ran for the barn, laughing despite themselves, soaked before they reached shelter. Inside, lightning illuminated the space in brilliant flashes. The horses whinnied nervously, stamping in their stalls. Annabel moved to them instinctively, her voice low and soothing. Easy now, easy. You're safe. The storm will pass. Charles watched her calming the frightened animals with practiced skill, her wet hair clinging to her face, her dress plastered to her frame. In that moment, he realized the truth he'd been fighting for weeks. He was falling in love with her. No, he had already fallen. That night, lying in their separate rooms, both stared at the ceiling, listening to rain drum against the roof, knowing everything had changed. The fire came at midnight in late September. Annabel woke to the smell of smoke, acrid and wrong. She bolted upright, her heart hammering. Through her window, an orange glow pulsed against the darkness. The barn. She ran barefoot across the yard, her nightgown whipping in the wind. Flames engulfed the structure, crackling and roaring like a living beast. The horses screamed inside, their cries splitting the night. Charles? Where was Charles? Then she saw him through the open barn doors, silhouetted against the inferno, trying to reach the horse stalls. A beam cracked overhead with a sound like a gunshot. It crashed down, and Charles disappeared beneath smoke and debris. Annabel didn't think. She grabbed a water bucket, doused herself, and charged into the flames. The heat was suffocating, stealing the air from her lungs. Smoke blinded her, but she pushed forward, coughing, her hands outstretched. Charles! She found him beneath a fallen beam, unconscious, his face covered in soot. With strength born of desperation, she heaved the beam aside. Splinters drove into her palms, her skin blistering from heat, but she didn't stop. She hooked her arms under his shoulders and dragged him backward, inch by agonizing inch, toward the door. They collapsed together in the dirt, just as neighbors arrived with buckets. Annabel cradled Charles's head in her lap, her burned hands trembling, tears streaming down her smoke-stained face. His eyes fluttered open. He stared up at her, confusion giving way to horror. You went in. You could have died. Her voice broke. So could you. He sat up abruptly, his hands finding her face, her shoulders, checking for injuries. When he saw her blistered palms, he made a sound like a wounded animal. God, Annabel, why? Because I can't lose you, she said, the words raw and honest. I can't lose someone I love. Charles went absolutely still. Then he pulled her to him, holding her like she was the only thing keeping him alive. I love you, he whispered fiercely into her hair. I can't lose you either. I can't do this life without you. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet. Marry me. Make this farm ours. Make this life ours. Through tears and soot and pain, Annabel smiled. Yes, yes, Charles, I'll marry you. Dawn revealed the devastation. The barn was a skeleton of charred timber, still smoking in the morning light. But in the ashes, Annabel found something that made her blood run cold. Burnt rags bearing the Caldwell Ranch brand. Evidence. Charles was still recovering from smoke inhalation, his lungs raw and damaged. So Annabel saddled the horse herself and rode alone through gathering storm clouds toward Fort Smith. 15 miles of hard riding with the wind picking up and thunder rolling across the Arkansas sky. The storm hit halfway there. Rain lashed her face, turning the road to mud, but she pressed on. By the time she reached Marshal Greer's office, she was soaked to the bone. her burned hands bleeding through makeshift bandages. The marshal took one look at her and called for coffee. Then he listened. She laid out everything: the threats, the fire, the evidence. Marshal Greer's face darkened with each detail. At dawn the next morning, he rode out with 6 federal deputies. They found the Caldwell brothers at their ranch, still celebrating. Jasper Caldwell screamed as they dragged him into the yard. "This is her fault! That dried-up witch ruined us!" Marshal Greer's voice was ice. "She saved an innocent man and brought criminals to justice. That's called courage, something you wouldn't recognize." The charges were filed: arson, attempted murder, extortion, conspiracy. Federal crimes that would see them hang or rot in prison for decades. 1 week later, Charles and Annabel stood on the courthouse steps in Fort Smith, the same steps where she'd been auctioned like livestock 3 months before. But this time, Marshal Greer stood before them as officiant. A small crowd of well-wishers gathered around. "Do you, Charles Hartwell, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Charles said firmly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Do you, Annabel Leafley, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Annabel's voice rang clear. "I do." The words felt like freedom. That evening, they returned to their farm, and stood together surveying what they'd built. The barn would be rebuilt, the cotton was ready for harvest, and they had each other. If you've ever felt too old for new beginnings, subscribe and never miss a story that proves love has no expiration date. November brought unseasonable warmth, the kind of weather that made animals restless and skies dangerous. Charles and Annabel were working in the rebuilt barn when the wind shifted, turning cold and violent in moments. The sky turned green. "Storm cellar, now!" Charles grabbed her hand and they ran. The wind howled like something alive, tearing at their clothes. They made it inside just as the freight train roar descended. The tornado lasted 3 minutes. It felt like eternity. When silence finally came, they emerged to devastation. Their farm had been spared the worst, but Van Buren to the north was destroyed. Smoke rose from a dozen fires. The Arkansas River had flooded its banks. "We have to help," Annabel said. They rode into town and found hell. Houses reduced to splinters, bodies being pulled from wreckage, families searching frantically for loved ones. Then Annabel heard it, a child's cry, weak and terrified. She ran toward the sound, Charles following. A collapsed house, beams crisscrossed like fallen timber, and beneath them, 2 children trapped in a pocket of space barely large enough to breathe. A girl, maybe 10 years old, clutching a younger boy to her chest. "Hold on," Annabel called. "We're getting you out." She and Charles worked frantically, lifting beams, clearing debris. Finally, they pulled the children free. The girl was conscious but in shock. The boy was younger, 7 maybe, sobbing into his sister's shoulder. "Mama and Papa," the girl whispered. "They were trying to get us to the ferry. The water took them." Annabel's heart shattered. She pulled both children close. "What are your names?" "Iris," the girl said. "This is Benjamin. We don't have anyone else. No aunts or uncles. Just us." Charles and Annabel exchanged a look. In it passed an entire conversation, an entire future. Charles knelt before them. "You have us now. If you'll let us, we'll take care of you, both of you." Annabel cradled Iris's face. "You're safe now. I promise you're safe." They brought the children home. That night, Iris and Benjamin slept in the guest room, exhausted and grieving. Charles and Annabel sat at the kitchen table, holding hands. "We're a family now," Charles said softly. "Yes," Annabel whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We are." Winter settled over the farm like a gentle blanket. The house that had been silent for so long now rang with children's voices. Slowly, carefully, the broken pieces began to heal. Iris was quiet at first, carrying the weight of her parents' death like stones in her pockets. But Annabel understood grief. She sat with the girl in the evenings, teaching her to sew, to read from the books Charles had kept from his own childhood. She never pushed, never demanded, just presence, just patience. One night, Iris looked up from her stitching. "Miss Annabel, will you teach me to make bread like Mama used to?" Annabel's throat tightened. "Of course, sweetheart, of course I will." Benjamin attached himself to Charles like a shadow. The boy followed him everywhere, to the barn, to the fields, watching with wide eyes as Charles explained the work of farming. Charles's heart, frozen for so long after losing his own child, began to thaw. "Can I help?" Benjamin asked one morning, his small voice hopeful. Charles handed him a bucket. "Every farmer needs a good partner. Let's feed the chickens together." Christmas came cold and clear. They had little money for gifts, but Annabel sewed new dresses for Iris from fabric she'd saved. Charles carved wooden horses for Benjamin. On Christmas morning, sitting around the fire, Iris whispered something that changed everything. "Can we call you Mama and Papa, or is that wrong?" Annabel pulled both children close, tears streaming. "It's not wrong. It's perfect. We'd be honored." Spring 1880 brought new life to the land. They planted together as a family of 4, tiny hands helping with seeds, laughter echoing across the fields. The community that had once gossiped now watched with quiet respect. In April, Charles rode to Fort Smith and began the legal adoption process. The papers would take months, but it didn't matter. In their hearts, Iris and Benjamin were already theirs. One evening, tucking Iris into bed, the girl grabbed Annabel's hand. "Will you always be our mama, even when we're grown?" Annabel kissed her forehead, her voice fierce with love. "Always. Forever. Nothing will ever change that." That night, lying beside Charles, Annabel marveled at the life they'd built. From an auction block to this, a family, a home, a future worth living. "God is good," she whispered. Charles squeezed her hand. "He surely is." September 1880 brought the Crawford County Harvest Festival to Van Buren. The entire community gathered to celebrate the end of a bountiful season. Tables overflowed with food. Music drifted across the town square. Children ran laughing between the booths. Annabel stood beside Charles, Iris and Benjamin close by, her heart full in a way she'd never imagined possible. The farm had thrived, the children had healed, and she, the woman once deemed too old, too worthless to matter, had found belonging. Charles squeezed her hand. "Stay right here. I have something for you." He walked to the center of the square, where the mayor was announcing awards for best crops and livestock. But Charles didn't wait for his turn. He simply stepped forward, holding a hand-carved cedar box. The crowd quieted. "Annabel Hartwell," he called. "Come here, please." Her face flushed as she walked forward, Iris and Benjamin trailing behind her. Charles opened the box, revealing official documents bearing the Fort Smith courthouse seal. "These are adoption papers," he said, his voice carrying across the square, "for Iris and Benjamin Kepler, who are now legally and forever Iris and Benjamin Hartwell." The children gasped. Benjamin's eyes filled with tears. Iris threw her arms around Annabel. Charles turned to the crowd, his voice strong and clear. "This woman, my wife Annabel Hartwell, was told she was too old to matter, too worn out to deserve kindness. But she saved my dying farm, she saved my life, and she taught me that the heart recognizes no expiration date on love or purpose or belonging." The crowd erupted in applause. Even those who had once mocked her now cheered with genuine respect. Annabel stood surrounded by her family, no longer invisible, but cherished. Iris held one hand, Benjamin the other, and Charles stood behind them all, his arms wrapped around his entire world. Later, walking home beneath Arkansas stars, Iris looked up at Annabel with a soft smile. "I'm glad that heartbroken farmer said you were perfect for him." Benjamin nodded. "Me too." Annabel's eyes filled with tears. "So am I, my darlings. So am I." If you've ever been told your best days are behind you, subscribe and let this story remind you love and new beginnings have no age limit.
If you enjoyed this latest story on life in the old Wild West, then I'm sure you will love the next one coming up. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you can get updates on time. Did I tell you we post new, exciting, heartwarming stories daily? Subscribe now to join us so you won't miss any new stories.